Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about the delay. It has nothing to do with the Austrian Gemütlichkeit. My name is Benedikt Sanzinger from the Multilateral Dialogue of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and together with our cooperation partner, Atomic Reporters, I'm delighted to welcome you to another episode of our joint webinar series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this online briefing is part of a series of webinars. The purpose of these regularly held webinars is to inform about and discuss important topics related to nuclear disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. Today's discussion will focus on how to advance nuclear disarmament, arms control, and risk reduction in a changing world, witnessing ongoing armed and trade conflicts, weakening of the nuclear disarmament and arms control architecture, including the collapse of important Cold War nuclear arms control treaties. I would like to introduce today's moderator, Tariq Rauf, who will then introduce our speakers. Tariq Rauf is a member of the Board of Directors of Atomic Reporters and Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Canadian PACWASH. He's former Head of Verification and Security Policy and alternate head of the NPT delegation at the International Atomic Energy Agency. For this webinar, please keep your audio and video sources turned off, and please submit the questions you might have through the Q&A function. The moderator will then select or summarize questions to the speakers and will try to accommodate all questions time permitting. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to a moderator, Tariq. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Benedikt, for your introduction. So we are very pleased today to have this web discussion on new perspectives on nuclear arms control in a changing world. And this is a little bit of an understatement given the important changes that are taking place. We have a couple of wars going on. The international nuclear arms control architecture is collapsing. Recent meetings of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the United Nations General Assembly First Committee, has seen a lot of rancor and discord between states possessing nuclear weapons, states in nuclear armed alliances, and non-nuclear weapon states. So we hope to address some of these challenges and try to come up with some new ways of how we can pull ourselves out of this distress. So we are very honored and grateful to have two expert speakers with us today. So we have Ambassador Alexander Kement. He's Director of Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Foreign Ministry. And from Stockholm, we have Dr. Tutti Irastu. She's Senior Researcher in the Weapons of Mass Destruction Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So our procedure will be, I will first invite Ambassador Kement to give an introductory statement, and I will put a question or two to him. Then we will move on to Dr. Irastu, and we can have a short discussion amongst ourselves. And then we will take the questions that the audience is putting up in the Q&A function. This program is being recorded and will be put up on the YouTube channels, both of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and also of Atomic Reporters. So with that, Ambassador Kement, may I invite you for your comments, please?
Thank you very much. I apologize again for having technical problems logging in. I would like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for inviting me once again, and Atomic Reporters for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm very glad about this. You framed it already. The status quo assessment, I think, is very disconcerting. I have just myself returned from the first committee of the UN General Assembly, which met until the end of until last week, and the fragmentation on almost every issue is palpable and was palpable. I've been following these issues for many years, and it was, in my recollection, never as difficult as it is now, with more very heated debates and more resolutions being voted on, and the spread of votes being very, very wide. So it doesn't look good. This takes place against the background of increasing geopolitical confrontation, tensions. We see arms race dynamics, and the multilateral structures for cooperation that we have look very dysfunctional, in part at least, or almost all of them. And some also experience a loss of legitimacy. Treaties are not implemented, partly abandoned. We've just now seen the de-ratification of the CTBT by one Annex II state. The nuclear taboo looks fragile. The taboo against nuclear testing and the moratorium looks fragile. We see qualitative arms race dynamics, and we see partly quantitative arms race dynamics as well. Modernization, upgrades, infrastructure investigation, in long-term massive investments into nuclear weapons. We see a re-emphasis on nuclear deterrence. We see more nuclear sharing. We see more extended nuclear deterrence. We see no credible prospect of even engaging into a discussion on how to move away from a nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence paradigm. Non-proliferation pressures, JCPOA, DPRK, I could go on. So the picture really is not very good, doesn't look very good. But we're not supposed to lament, but we're supposed to talk about what can be done and by whom. And of course, I don't have any silver bullet answers, but I will try to make a few comments in this direction. So there are, of course, different type of actors, layers of actors who all have different roles to play. And most of all, of course, the nuclear armed states, they, of course, have the most important actions to do when it comes to nuclear weapons. But then there is also the non-nuclear majority of states. Don't forget, more than 150 states have forsworn nuclear weapons and have decided not to rely on nuclear weapons. And there are also other stakeholders, of course, experts and civil society actors. We also have different fora and frameworks. We have, of course, bilateral tracks between nuclear armed states and plurilateral ones between and among the nuclear armed states. And then we have regional and multilateral frameworks. So all of them have different opportunities, different roles, but I will focus specifically on what the non-nuclear majority can do, or maybe how they see these issues. And of course, one of the traditional roles that the majority of states has done is to encourage nuclear armed states to engage and to implement treaties and to take steps towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. And of course, now we have specifically the issue of the breakdown of nuclear arms control. So we will, of course, appeal to the US and Russia, and also US and China to engage in arms control talks. The expiration of the New START in 2026 is of great concern. On the more positive...
Alexander?
Yeah?
Can I interrupt for a technical announcement? A number of people are having difficulty logging in. So those who can hear us, can you please re-register and then log in again from the link that you get? And the webinar has already started. So sorry for that interruption, yeah. Alexander, please continue.
Okay. So I think non-nuclear weapon states will continue with their appeals. And of course, now the reminder to the nuclear weapon states that the resumption of nuclear arms control and the reduction of nuclear weapons is an obligation under the NPT, I think is very important. But beyond the kind of not very successful in the past appeal to the nuclear weapon states, what can the non-nuclear weapon states do? And I think there I have a couple of points I wanted to raise. One of them is the priority number one, the first order of priority from my perspective is to preserve the treaties that we have, to preserve international law, to preserve the multilateral approach and multilateral frameworks dealing with nuclear weapons, even if they are difficult at the moment and not functioning well at the moment. So investments into these frameworks must increase, specifically at this time. And I think small and medium-sized states have most to lose if this regime falters. This means, of course, more engagement in the NPT, more engagement in the CTBT, and more engagement in the new addition to the multilateral treaty regime, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I think a worry I have is an engagement, because the situation is difficult, because progress looks hard to achieve, that states may disengage. And I would make the point that because it's difficult and not promising, that's why we need to increase the engagement. This is something where I also believe a large cross-regional coalition of states supporting multilateral approach to nuclear weapons can be built and must be built in a much stronger way. I hope, for example, that the non-aligned states will react to the increased tension, not in a kind of equidistant disengagement, but in a very strong engagement. And I think many other countries would be ready to work on this. And the fact that the situation is difficult is also why Austria, my own country, is investing specifically into these issues at the moment. So this would also entail, for example, discussions on how we can move out of the business as usual, a reform of the multilateral system. There was an attempt to revive the SSOD4, the special session of disarmament discussion, which didn't get much traction at the first committee now. But I think we need to have a discussion like that. We need to talk about how consensus is increasingly abused, and we need to be more open to flexible formats. The second point, the second sort of order of priority, or maybe even the first one, is to strengthen the nuclear taboo. And I think that is something where the non-nuclear weapon majority has a very important role to play. And I think in the TPNW context, we have done that at the first meeting of states parties last year with very, very strong language in the declaration agreed to by all TPNW states parties, really underscoring the importance of the taboo against any use or threat of use with nuclear weapons. This was then taken up in the G20 context when the threat of nuclear weapons was seen as, was called inadmissible, which I think is an important development. But we see, of course, disconcerting nuclear rhetoric. We are worried about normalization of nuclear use, talk about tactical use of tactical nuclear weapons. We see some highly irresponsible statements, including from academic experts. For example, in Russia, some very worrying expert comments have been issued in recent months. So the absolute rejection of any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons must be clearer, and the unacceptability of it. And I think the TPNW states parties will certainly continue to do this. But in a way, we have to raise, non-nuclear weapon states have to raise the deterrence against any legitimacy related to the use and threat of nuclear weapons as being clearly beyond the pale of acceptability and responsibility. And I think there is much more that the non-nuclear majority can and must do at this moment when nuclear risks are very high. And the third point I wanted to raise is maybe not spectacular, but I think it is very important. It is to broaden the debate about nuclear weapons. I think we need to wake up from the belief that this is a topic of the past. I think it's very clear and a very clear and present danger. And change on this issue will come, if at all, through a broad societal engagement. I think we need to discuss nuclear weapons much more broadly again, and not limited to a small security expert community, because in a way we have proven that we are not solving the issue. So we need to include other stakeholders from the humanitarian community, the economic, the risk analysis, health, developmental, climate, and so on. And we have to look at the interrelationship of what happens in terms of consequences if nuclear weapons are used. And we need to increase, therefore, the awareness about what is available in terms of new research about humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and risks of nuclear weapons. And in this debate, I think we need to juxtapose the assumptions around nuclear deterrence as the ultimate security provider, which of course at the end of the day is a theory that is very hard to prove. We need to juxtapose this with the empirical facts that we have on the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons if deterrence fails. Because we won't know and we can't know if nuclear deterrence will hold in any given scenario. It's ultimately always a bet on behalf of all humanity. It's an assumption, and it has the risk of overconfidence and of confirmation bias. But we do know that nuclear deterrence can fail. And if it fails, we do have the scientific evidence that it fails with much more global and catastrophic consequences than previously known. And there is a growing body of evidence to back this up. So this is a very important debate that needs to be done in a broad societal level. And how we achieve this debate is, of course, is a big challenge. But I think partly we achieve this by increasing global support for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and by increasingly emphasizing the scientific evidence around humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. So this is, of course, a gradual approach, a discursive approach, but one that I think has the chance to be really transformational. It builds, of course, on the argument that increasing international pressure will increase the pressure to have this conversation. So the non-nuclear majority cannot force any state to give up nuclear weapons. But what the majority can do is underline the grave uncertainties that underpin a security architecture that is based on the permanent threat of global mass destruction. And it can also highlight the profound issues regarding the legitimacy or lack thereof and the international and also intergenerational justice dimensions that a security architecture based on nuclear deterrence will bring and brings to all humanity, that ultimately all humanity carries the burden and carries the risk of this paradigm going wrong. So this is a long-term process, of course. It's very difficult because the beliefs around nuclear deterrence are held very strongly. But I think it is absolutely now the time at the moment when we actually see in some states a re-emphasis on nuclear weapons, that the majority of non-nuclear weapon states is putting forward this alternative security paradigm and this, in my view, very fundamental challenge to the logic of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. I stop here, Tariq. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Clement. You gave us a very broad menu of how to think about the current challenges, and you also talked about the need for flexibility, revitalizing the institutions. You talked about reconvening the UN Special Session on disarmament, but more importantly, I think you devoted time on ensuring that there is no use of nuclear weapons, and we maintain the 75-year taboo, not only against the use of nuclear weapons, but also against the threat of use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states, and growing evidence about the humanitarian consequences. But do you now think that for the time being, we cannot expect to have any resumption or new multilateral negotiations on a new treaty, such as the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, or to bring the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBT, into force? And is the future unilateral move by the nuclear armed states, or bilateral or executive type agreements like we had the SORT treaty, because we don't think, for example, in the United States, there is appetite for ratifying another arms control agreement. And if that's the case, what are the options for the non-nuclear weapon states? You mentioned the G20 statement, both from Bali, but also from New Delhi, which had this one line about the inadmissibility of the use of nuclear weapons. But I'm critical of that because it's a throwaway line in there. They do not specify any move on how to make this inadmissible. So they're just getting credit cheaply by just repeating this line. So it's a sort of a pessimistic view from my part on that one.
Shall I
Yes, please.
comment on the points? I focus specifically on the issues that I think, as I call it, the non-nuclear majority of states can do. I didn't want to imply, of course, that work on all the issues that you mentioned should not take place. First of all, I referred specifically to the need for engagement with the CTBT, specifically now when Russia has taken the step of de-ratification. We need more emphasis on it. So that's the first thing. On the FMCT, of course, that would be great, but we know the situation has been stuck in the Conference on Disarmament for many years now, for 25 years. I worry that we will get an FMCT when it won't matter anymore. Yeah, when those states that are currently reluctant to start negotiations have built reserves in fissile material to maintain their nuclear weapon stockpile for the indefinite future. And we will end up with an FMCT where, of course, existing stocks will be excluded. So any disarmament value that such a treaty may have had some time ago diminishes by the day. That, of course, doesn't mean that it would be a meaningless treaty, but I think that's the dynamic we're still in, and I do not see this changing for the time being. Your comment on the G20 statement, of course, one can always be cynical about statements like that. I still think it, I see it in the continuation, because the Bali meeting came shortly after the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW, where TPNW states parties really pushed this issue very strongly. Several TPNW states parties are members of the G20, and this is obviously a compromise between some TPNW states parties who wanted more and some nuclear weapon states who obviously wanted less. But it nevertheless constitutes a certain improvement, and I think a certain higher level underscoring the unacceptability of the threat of nuclear weapons. I wanted to also comment very briefly on use and threat of use. And of course, proponents of nuclear deterrence will make the point that the threat is different from the use. And of course, until you use it, you haven't used it. You've only threatened it. But of course, the whole backbone, the whole concept of nuclear deterrence relies on the capability and on the readiness of use. And what does the readiness of use mean? Certainly from the perspective of the non-nuclear majority of states, it means the readiness to inflict humanitarian consequences that we now know more on a global and catastrophic scale. So the distinction between threat and use is ultimately not very logical, because deterrence relies on the readiness of use. That, of course, the assumption is that the threat will suffice and they will never be used, doesn't change that. It is logically based on the readiness of use. So I've always struggled with the conceptual manner in which one can argue the distinction between threat and use, because from my perspective, they are absolutely intrinsically linked. Of course, use is worse than threat of use, but it's still an artificial distinction. You made some other points which I can't remember now. Maybe I can
come back to those later.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, thank you. So I'd like to now invite Dr. Rastu from CIPRI for her views on the current impasse and any suggestions or recommendations on how we pull ourselves out from our predicament today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for inviting me as well. Yeah, you gave us a very difficult task by asking us to share our thoughts on how to break out of the current impasse on nuclear disarmament, especially because we were supposed to offer new perspectives. And yeah, the thing is that there are already many good old ideas out there, but the problem is that the nuclear armed states lack the political will to put these ideas into practice. And this was the case already long before the Ukraine war, but now with the new Cold War between Russia and the West, progress seems even more difficult. So instead of arms control, the trend now among nuclear armed states and also their allies is to boost deterrence. And as Alexander just explained, old arms control agreements have collapsed or weakened. So it's not looking very good. And Alex did a great job in focusing on what non-nuclear weapon states can do, and I'll focus a bit more on nuclear weapon states and their allies. So in theory, it would be easy to provide a long list of steps that would promote disarmament, but none of them seem realistic due to the prevailing circumstances. I still think it's useful to make a distinction between those steps that nuclear armed states could afford to do without undermining their respective nuclear deterrence and those that could undermine deterrence. So the former would seem to be more achievable given the right political circumstances, while the latter would be harder. And I'm not saying this to signal acceptance of the logic of nuclear deterrence, but simply to recognize that this logic is very deeply ingrained in the security thinking of these states. So in particular, no nuclear armed states can be expected to make a compromise that would significantly undermine the survivability of their second strike nuclear forces, unless they are already very close to accepting complete nuclear disarmament, which means that their mindset has already changed significantly. And I don't think this will happen overnight in most cases. So on this basis, I would argue that the following steps would be doable if the political circumstances were right, either unilaterally or as part of some kind of arms control agreements. First, related to the recent news about Russian de-ratification of the CTBT, Russia could, I think, easily re-ratify the CTBT together with the long overdue US and Chinese ratification of the treaty. This is politically hard, but I think a firm commitment not to conduct more nuclear weapon tests would really have little impact on any of these countries' nuclear deterrence. So I think they could afford to do that. Second, NATO could adopt a no first use policy and give up the tactical nuclear weapons that don't really serve any military purpose. And this is because, again, it is politically impossible at the moment, but NATO is superior compared to Russia in terms of its conventional forces. So it simply has no need to retain the doctrine of first use, which is not even that credible. And it's not credible because of the consensus requirement at the nuclear planning group at NATO, which requires a consensus among about 30 democracies on the need on the use of nuclear weapons. So on this basis, you could claim that NATO already has a de facto no first use policy, so it wouldn't really be giving up anything. And as for the tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, they have for a long time been recognized to play mostly a symbolic assurance role rather than serving actual deterrence needs. In addition to that, these weapons are not survivable. In other words, they could easily be destroyed during a hypothetical nuclear war. So they are not really even credible as a second strike nuclear capability. Yeah, but like I just said, politically, it would be very difficult to do this, and this was the case already when times were, better from the point of view of the prospects of nuclear arms control, and even when countries like Germany were calling for the withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons from its territory. This was ultimately linked to reciprocal Russian reductions. But yeah, to repeat, I don't think these steps, getting rid of tactical nuclear weapons or or adopting a no first use policy, I don't think they would undermine NATO deterrence in any way. Third, I think Russia could easily undo its nuclear sharing arrangement with Belarus, which also doesn't add much to either country's security, in my view. Again, politically, it's impossible since this arrangement was only recently declared, but it's something that Russia could, I think, relatively easily trade away in potential future arms control agreements. Fourth, the United States could limit its strategic missile defense system, including by making a pledge not to deploy or develop space-based missile defenses. Because US strategic missile defenses are still relatively limited and space-based missile defense is unfeasible, the United States could put a cap on these capabilities without actually even scaling down existing infrastructure. And this would help alleviate Russian and especially Chinese threat perceptions about the potentially unlimited US missile defense development, ultimately undermining their nuclear deterrence. And again, from the point of view of the bipartisan opposition in the United States to any such limits, this seems impossible politically. But again, it would do nothing to undermine US nuclear deterrent. On the contrary, these kinds of limits could provide an incentive for China and Russia to engage in arms control. And I think all nuclear armed states could afford to provide unconditional and legally binding negative security assurances to all non-nuclear weapon states, at least to those non-nuclear weapon states that are not part of extended nuclear deterrence arrangements. And I think this kind of a commitment to never use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states would not undermine nuclear deterrence, but instead it would constitute a long overdue step by nuclear weapon states that would strengthen the norm against nuclear weapon use and perhaps also prevent further proliferation. Of course, the Russian threats in connection with its war on Ukraine suggest that these kinds of negative security assurances might undermine deterrence from the Russian perspective, at least in the case that the implication of these threats is that nuclear weapons could be used on Ukrainian ground. But by accepting unconditional and binding negative security assurances, at least other nuclear armed states could show that they don't accept this kind of an interpretation of nuclear deterrence. And finally, a much less ambitious idea that shouldn't even be too difficult politically, China and the United States could launch strategic stability talks similar to those that the United States and Russia held before these were suspended last year. And in fact, these two countries reportedly already agreed to at least look into this possibility already 2 years ago. And yeah, it's hard to imagine this kind of dialogue leading to any mutual reductions in the US and Chinese arsenals, given the disparity in the size of those arsenals, but it could anyway build confidence and alleviate some of the worst case assumptions that are driving armament dynamics. In addition, there are plenty of more ideas that are even less controversial than most of the ideas that I mentioned, including those that have been agreed at the NPT context, like the final documents in 2000 and 2010 that you're all familiar with. And yeah, some of my suggestions also relate to these, because the need to bring the CTBT into force and to strengthen the negative security assurances are also mentioned in these documents. And then I was also asked by Tariq to say something on the P5 process. So far, it seems that the biggest achievement by the P5 was the statement repeating the Reagan-Gorbachev words that a nuclear war can't be won and shouldn't be fought. However, this message was undermined only a month later when Russia invaded Ukraine and made nuclear threats to keep NATO out of the war. So suggesting that actually a nuclear war could be fought. And other things that the P5 have suggested they might do was to do something related to the unsigned negative security assurance related protocol of the Bangkok Treaty, or the Southeast Asian nuclear weapons free zone. And this was already in 2019, and still, last time I checked, this protocol still lacks signatures by all of the 5 states. In addition, the P5 agreed to organize a side event on nuclear policies and doctrines at the 2020 review conference, and to conduct further work on the glossary of key nuclear terms. And we saw no such events last year when the RevCon was organized, and I'm also not aware of any sequel to the previous P5 glossary, and I don't think that would contribute that much to disarmament anyway. So as far as I know, there are some expert level discussions on nuclear doctrines and strategic risk reduction ongoing under the Russian chairmanship at the moment. And I have to say, I have no idea how these discussions are going or what they're aiming at exactly, but I guess it's good that the P5 are still talking to each other. Ideally, these discussions would focus on identifying and implementing some concrete risk reduction measures, although thus far the NPT discussions on this issue have been at a very abstract level. And as for the next PrepCon, it's hard to think what could be done next year to make things better. But lately there's been a lot of talk about reporting and transparency, so maybe we'll see some progress here, although it hardly counts as disarmament. Some perhaps bigger, although still modest steps that might be achievable next year would be what I just said about the P5 process. So maybe some concrete risk reduction steps, or even new signatures or ratifications of the NSA protocols of the nuclear weapon free zone treaties. But this would already be asking a lot compared to what we have seen before. But anyway, these kinds of things could help to improve the mood at the NPT a bit, although much more would be needed to prevent yet another failure in the next review conference. And perhaps it's needless to say that as long as the war in Ukraine continues, it will continue to poison the atmosphere at the NPT. And it will also likely prevent arms control or strategic dialogues between the two major nuclear weapon states that have the main responsibility for nuclear disarmament. It has also been noted in recent NPT discussions that umbrella states also have responsibility for nuclear disarmament. And yeah, I presented some ideas related to that about NATO no first use policy and withdrawal of tactical nuclear weapons from allied territories, although I realize that all this sounds hopelessly naive in the current circumstances. However, I think what allied countries could do at minimum is to refrain from further increasing their own reliance on nuclear weapons. For example, if South Korea enters into new nuclear sharing arrangements with the United States, or worse, if it develops its own nuclear weapons, this would clearly not be good for the NPT. And similarly, the calls for new types of theater nuclear weapons will hopefully not receive significant support in Europe. In general, I think it would be good for US allies, both in Europe and Asia, to recognize that they already have superior conventional deterrents compared to their adversaries, which is why they really don't need to increase their reliance on nuclear weapons. And I think I'll stop here.
So thank you very much, Tuti. You gave us a very rich menu of suggestions and proposals. And as Alexander pointed out, it's not that we don't have interesting proposals on the table and interesting commitments already from previous NPT review conferences, as you mentioned, but it's the fact that these are not being implemented. I wanted to ask you about strategic stability, because this is a concept that is being used more and more by the nuclear armed states and their allies in nuclear defense arrangements under them. So during the Cold War, it was argued that arms control agreements enhanced first strike stability by eliminating incentives for a disarming first strike, by shaping the structure of nuclear forces and limiting the capabilities that increased relative vulnerabilities. But now this is changing, as you also indicated. We have now longer range precision guided conventional weapons. The fire break between nuclear and conventional weapons is also getting blurred. And then we have these emerging and disruptive new technologies. So how should we approach this issue of strategic stability and its various elements of first strike stability, arms race stability, crisis stability? Is this something you've worked on recently, or you have any views on this?
I guess one way to start would be to recognize that different nuclear weapon states understand strategic stability in very different ways. So I guess for China and Russia, they have been very concerned about and especially China, about the survivability of their second strike nuclear forces. So I guess I would argue, I would guess that, their perspective on that, whereas the United States and NATO at the moment, they are worried about Russian first use, but not in the sense of a disarming first strike, but as a tactical use to kind of to de-escalate, or that's not a good word, as a coercive nuclear threat to control escalation in a regional war. And I guess that's the most likely case of nuclear weapons being used. I'm not saying that Russia is necessarily the only one, the most likely to use it in general, but that kind of limited nuclear weapon use seems more of a problem in general than this disarming first strike. So yeah, I guess it would be helpful if these kinds of differences would be discussed in the strategic dialogues, which are unfortunately not ongoing anymore between the US and Russia, but hopefully that will resume at some point. And I guess as I suggested, the US and China should also have their discussions on that. And I think, yeah, I think arms control could actually, and confidence building measures could actually address some of these concerns if these states would have an interest in discussing these issues.
Thank you. So I'll put another proposition to you, and then we will bring in Alexander. So it is reported that on Monday, this past Monday, in Beijing, the United States and China had a working level meeting for the first time on arms control issues, and the Chinese informed that for them, their understanding of strategic stability is among nuclear equals, and that they clearly are not an equal at the moment of Russia and the United States, and therefore they are not prepared to talk about strategic stability with the US. They also said that in their understanding, the US push for strategic stability talks is to try to limit the growth of the Chinese arsenal, and the Chinese reportedly said that they are now increasing their arsenal because their security situation has changed and they feel more vulnerable, but that they still retain their no first use policy that has been their traditional policy. So they also are suspicious of US intentions for talking about these issues with China in the first place. So if that is the case, a term that we use sometimes in the early discourse between the Soviet Union and the United States in the 60s and the 70s was developing a common strategic language, where the two sides would have common understandings of terms like deterrence, arms control, stability, and so on. And while the Russians and Americans understand each other, we don't have that yet between China and the United States. So how do you think we need to encourage a continuation of this, even though the two sides are on different planes as regards these particular issues?
That's a good question. And I think, yeah, it's unfortunate that China sees it that way. But on the other hand, there's also a tendency, I guess, to based on the US-Russian example, to think of strategic stability talks as preparation for arms control. But maybe if it would be more about what you said that was done before, like finding common language and exchanging threat perceptions, I think that might, and confidence building, I think China has an interest in that as well, especially because the worst case assumptions in the US is that China is building up its nuclear arsenal because it wants to reach parity between the US and Russia, or because it has aggressive aims, and because it wants to, I don't know, be able to control escalation in the region. I mean, with respect to building up, maybe more limited nuclear strike options. So, yeah, I guess the problem is that the nuclear armed states are not seeing an interest in these dialogues or in arms control, but I guess also if this dialogue would be framed more as dialogue rather than as preparation for arms control, that China obviously is not interested in with the United States because of the difference in the size of the arsenals, then maybe it would be more successful. And related to what you said about finding common language, I mean, ideally the P5 process could be used for that instead of, the glossary of key terms. It might be more useful if these countries would think about this, what strategic stability means for them and so on.
Thank you. So coming back to you, Alexander, is this discourse on strategic stability, in your view, code words for continuing with the policies of nuclear deterrence whose risks you pointed out in your early intervention?
Short answer is yes, in my view. The belief of proponents of nuclear deterrence in the irreplaceability of this concept is very entrenched, and I have not seen much indication at all of readiness of challenging it or moving beyond it. So we see, of course, an arms control approach, which of course is to be welcomed, which is the reduction of numbers, but it's all while retaining nuclear deterrence. So I haven't seen that yet. And I think what the non-nuclear weapon states want is exactly that engagement, a credible perspective of how one could, or how the world could move out of this very precarious paradigm. Of course, there are now all sorts of new technologies coming into the field, from artificial intelligence to hypersonic weapons to cyber and so on. And we see a discussion about this as being increasing the risk of nuclear deterrence, but in a way we see discussions how these technologies could be integrated into the concept of nuclear deterrence, rather than asking the question, to what extent do these new technologies maybe challenge the veracity of the concept as such. We see a focus on strategic risk reduction, which of course is important, no question about that. Any step that reduces risk of nuclear conflict is positive, but the way the strategic risk reduction discussion is framed is all within the concept of nuclear deterrence, whereas the majority of non-nuclear weapon states want to talk about risk reduction in the broad sense, including the risks of nuclear deterrence itself. And that discussion isn't taking place. So yes, that was now a long answer to your question, but I think the terminology that is being used is very much an indicator that there is, at the moment at least, absolutely no readiness or apparently even sort of intellectual effort being spent on whether or not one could move away from this concept.
Thank you. So we'll move on to some questions and comments that have come in. So I will go off screen, but I will remain on the microphone. And so we have a comment from Jonathan Tyrone, who's a Vienna-based journalist. And I think this is addressed to you, Alexander. He wants to know what's the status of discussions among the CPNW states when it comes to the application of sanctions and or trade tariffs on nuclear weapons suppliers, and what measures could be contemplated to ostracize enabling individuals or designate economic activities as taboo that are related to the nuclear weapons enterprise. And for Tutti, there's a comment by Ambassador Carlo Trezza. He says that you are right about no first use would be a non-starter, and that NATO has a kind of de facto no first use policy. India and China are also committed to it, and Russia and China have a bilateral arrangement. So that's his comment, but I'll sort of turn it into a question. You know, the Soviet Union always stated that it had a no first use policy, and nobody believed them because we cannot verify it. There's no way of measuring no first use. It's a declaratory statement that is pretty cheap. It can always be reversed on a whim. So perhaps you could address that. And there's one more comment that I will put, either or both of you could address that. And that again relates to the declaratory policy of no first use. Could be a positive signal to end the launch on warning or launch under attack scenarios. And on the other hand, ending launch on warning or ending launch on attack is rejected or dismissed by the nuclear weapon states because they see this as challenging deterrence doctrine. And so I think your comments on that also would be interesting. So I'll start with you, Alexander, and then go to Tutti.
Thank you. On the question of Jonathan, we haven't discussed this at all in the TPNW context, the sanctions issue. I would expect that views would be quite diverse among TPNW states parties. So the discussion really, we try to focus the discussion on the weapons and what the weapons do, and the importance of making progress on nuclear disarmament. And I think once, as long as states parties stay on this issue, we will be strong. If we bring in lots of other issues, views might be very, very diverse. And on the launch on warning, no first use, I think these are all examples to what I said before. If risk reduction would be discussed in a broad sense, taking nuclear weapons off high alert status would be an obvious measure to take. And it is rejected by nuclear armed states because, of course, nuclear deterrence relies on the readiness and preparedness always at all times to be credibly prepared to use these weapons. So it's seen as undermining the credibility of nuclear deterrence. And I think this is part of the challenge that we face when we approach the nuclear risk reduction issue. I think de-alerting is a perfect example of the broad nuclear risk reduction perspective that the non-nuclear majority of states share versus the strategic risk reduction focus of nuclear weapon states, which is more limited and which does not look favorably at these kind of issues.
Thank you. Tuti?
Yeah, on no first use, you're right. It's just, it's just cheap talk in principle, but I think if it's reflected in the actual posture and capabilities, in the sense that a country doesn't have, or an alliance doesn't invest in these so-called battlefield nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, then that makes it more credible. Because like I said before, I think the most likely scenario where nuclear weapons would be used and where they are now threatened is in connection with regional wars. So I think by itself, such a declaratory policy is not credible, but if it's reflected in capabilities, then it's more credible. And as for the Soviet no first use doctrine, I've heard that it wasn't considered credible, and when you look at the Soviet arsenal at the time, it wasn't really reflected in its posture. But I think the Chinese no first use policy has been credible for a long time. Now it's building up its arsenal, which has made people to question its declaratory policy. But in the case of NATO, I think, it's already kind of, they don't have a no first use policy, but it would be more credible because of the conventional balance of forces. They don't have the need from the point of view of this escalation control thinking to threaten first use.
So I think, the best demonstration of a no first use policy would be to take land-based systems off alert. Originally, we had the triad where the bombers were also on alert. So the bombers were taken off alert at the end of the Cold War. So now only land-based missiles are on alert, and as are submarines. So a real no first use policy would be to take land-based missiles off alert and only leave the submarine-based missiles on alert status, which again creates a bit of a fire break. But since we're running out of time, I wanted to come to two last points that I will put to you, and then we will wrap up. So after the Russian invasion started in February of last year, the US policy and the Western policy was that there could be no discourse with Russia on any arms control issue unless the Russians stopped the war and withdrew from all parts of Ukrainian sovereign territory. The Russian response to that came that as long as the West has the policy of the strategic defeat of Russia in the Ukraine war, the Russians will not come to the table. And they sort of demonstrated that by announcing the suspension of New START, their implementation, now the de-ratification of the CTBT. But then in June, the US National Security Advisor, in a speech to the Arms Control Association, offered talks with both China and Russia without conditions, but with accountability. So this is coming back to this concept of compartmentalization. And we had this concept, that's why we got the NPT, we got the CTBT, but if we mix regional security issues and others with arms control, particularly nuclear arms control, then we're not getting either arms control or regional peace and security. So that's one comment to put before you. And the second is that a lot of the literature now talks about what they call a multi-domain environment. So not only do we have now 3 actors rather than 2, and different dyads, US-Russia, US-China, and then China-Russia. And then multi-domain means, as Alexander referred to, not only nuclear weapons, and as you referred to the conventional weapons, but also cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, missile defense, hypersonic systems, nuclear-powered delivery systems. And so this is creating a concept that the US calls integrated deterrence, bringing in all these domains, which complicates the issue even further. So again, starting with you, Alexander, any views on the comments that I made and any concluding thoughts as well, please?
Thank you very much. I was in Washington actually listening to Jake Sullivan's speech live, which was very, very well calibrated. On the one hand, talking about building up credible deterrence and increasing that, and on the other hand, the offer of unconditional, not unconditional, of talks with Russia and China without preconditions. I think the US is rightly, as we all are, concerned about the expiration of New START in 2026. So I think it's an important invitation. To what extent the US expected this invitation to be taken up, I think, I don't know, but I think it is, in any case, the issue is so important that compartmentalization of nuclear talks is important. On Ukraine, I just want to say one aspect that is probably not discussed very much, but since Russia's invasion of Ukraine was coupled with implicit but unmistakable nuclear threats, there is, of course, a very, very significant importance for the future of the nuclear regime that nuclear threats are not successful. And on the multi-domain environment, that of course is true. And I think your point of linking it and thereby making it more complicated is also very, very pertinent. But I think it just underscores the fact that nuclear deterrence as a concept, essentially from a bipolar world in the Cold War, really today looks extremely precarious, given that we have a multitude of actors being engaged in various nuclear deterrence relationships, coupled with new technologies and corresponding new technological arms races, and cyber and artificial intelligence definitely have a very serious bearing on the nuclear domain. So the arguments around strategic stability and security being provided by nuclear weapons in a multi-domain environment, look very shaky from my perspective. And I think it just underscores the importance of having a serious international engagement of challenging this paradigm and taking steps away from it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Tuti.
Sorry, my screen was locked for a while. Yeah, on compartmentalization, yeah, it's great that that the US made that statement, and unfortunate that Russia hasn't really been receptive to it. But I think in principle, maybe it could be receptive to it if it saw some interest in arms control talks with the US. And I don't know, I mean, we've had this deadlock since the New START negotiations. And I guess the problem is that they are not seeing an interest in further nuclear weapons reductions without also including other things like missile defense. So I think the problem might have more to do with that, although I mean, you can't really overestimate the impact of the current political circumstances, but so compartmentalization would be good, but I guess more important of what's actually being talked about. And about the multi-domain issues and challenges, they are, I mean, it's challenging, but I guess many of these things could actually be tackled in arms control if there would be political will, like hypersonic or conventional long-range weapons. They could be counted as part of the strategic arms control agreements, even if they are not nuclear armed. And cyber AI, I think it's okay, that I don't think you can really include in arms control, because how do you verify something like software? But I think you might have some kind of confidence building measures on that. And about again, you also mentioned missile defense. I think I can't remember if you mentioned space, but I think if there would be these a little bit utopian sounding limits on US missile defenses, that might actually have an impact on the development of counter space capabilities by some other states, because I think these things are related. So in brief, I think it's what's really lacking is political will, and these challenges could be tackled in future arms control agreements.
So thank you very much. It's interesting that an old proposal is being resurrected in some quarters. After START 2 was negotiated, there was talk about START 3. At that time, it was President Bush, the senior, and also President Gorbachev. They had this famous meeting on a ship in the middle of a storm off the coast of Gibraltar, where Ambassador James Goodby from the US presented a paper that in SALT 3, the unit of account should be all types of nuclear warheads, and we don't make a distinction between so-called strategic warhead or tactical warhead. A warhead is a warhead. It's the delivery system to a certain extent that defines its category. And so this is now coming back on the table to put all types of warheads in the follow-on to New START. And in the early 1970s, there was a very important conference on the prevention of accidental nuclear war. And perhaps this is something that at the TPNW meeting coming up on the 27th of November in New York, that could be a call for having another conference on the prevention of accidental nuclear war, because we are actually, I think, pretty close to having an accident in the context of Ukraine and the overflights around borders and also in the Asia-Pacific theater. So let me thank both Ambassador Clement and also Dr. Arastu for being with us this afternoon. This event is the last event of the year, jointly organized by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Atomic Reporters. We hope to be back in January. We'll let you know where we will be. So I would like to thank, on behalf of Atomic Reporters, our partners in the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, in particular, Benedikt Danzinger, Eva Dolova, and also Jeanette Khanousi for their support. The next online event by Atomic Reporters will be on assessing the second meeting of the TPNW and looking forward to the third meeting of the TPNW. This will be online on the 5th of December in the same time slot as today, and notices will be sent out to those who get our normal notices from Atomic Reporters. So with that, thank you to the participants, thank you to the speakers, and over to you, Benedikt, for closing us out today.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Thank you to our excellent speakers today, Dr. Eresto and Ambassador Kment, for your elaborations on the apparent breakdown of nuclear arms control that we are witnessing right now. I would like to thank our audience from around the world for your comments and multiple questions. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation will continue to provide a platform for discussion, as it is our genuine agenda to make a contribution to broader the debate about nuclear weapons and deterrence to a wider public. As Tarek mentioned, this will be our last webinar in the year 2023. I would like to thank you, Tarek, and Atomic Reporters for your cooperation, and you will be informed about upcoming webinars as usual via email. I wish you a pleasant evening, stay safe, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Night.
Bye.